Yes, there are moments in life when it is very helpful to look back. Not because we want to live in the past, not because everything was better then, and certainly not because we can somehow turn back the clock. But sometimes we need to look back simply to remember how we got here to this present moment. We look back at the people who shaped us, the places that formed us, the experiences that changed us, the mistakes from which we learned, the moments of grace which we didn't fully recognize until much later. And when we look carefully enough, we may discover that running through all of it, through the good and the difficult, through the celebrations and the disappointments, there has been a quiet thread of God's faithfulness. That is exactly what God asks the people to do in our reading from Isaiah today. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn and to the quarry from which you were dug. In other words, remember where you came from. And to understand why those words matter so much, we need just a little historical context. The book we call Isaiah contains prophetic material arising from different periods in Israel's history. This specific chapter, Isaiah 51, belongs to a portion scholars commonly call Second Isaiah, particularly Isaiah chapters 40 through 55. These words speak into the experience of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. Jerusalem had been devastated. The temple had been destroyed. Many of the people had been carried away from their homeland. The institutions that had given their lives stability were now gone. Their world had completely changed. And after living with displacement and uncertainty for years, God's people faced a deeply human question. Is there still a future for us? Can God still do something with what remains? Can something new grow out of what feels to us in this moment broken? And into that uncertainty, the prophet says, look to the rock from which you were hewn. Then Isaiah becomes even more specific. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who bore you. Remember Abraham. Remember Sarah. Remember how their story began. God did not begin with a mighty nation. God began with just two people. Two aging people, in fact, who had every reason to believe that the future they had hoped for was no longer possible for them. And yet, God called them. God blessed them. And from that seemingly impossible beginning came a people with a story that would continue for generations. So when Isaiah tells the exiles to remember Abraham and Sarah, he is not inviting them to indulge in nostalgia. He is reminding them of who God is. The God who created a future before can create a future again. That is the point. Remembering God's faithfulness in the past gives us courage to trust God's faithfulness in our future. And then Isaiah gives us an extraordinary image. The Lord will comfort Zion. He will comfort all her waste places and will make her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord. Wilderness becoming Eden, desert becoming garden. Waste places becoming places where once again there will be joy and gladness, thanksgiving, and the voices of song. What a remarkable promise to a people standing among ruins. God says, I am not finished yet. And perhaps that is a word some of us need to hear, because all of us have wilderness places. There are places in our lives where things did not turn out the way that we expected or wanted. Relationships that changed, people we loved and lost, plans that never materialized, doors that closed, dreams that had to be revised. And there are times when we look at our lives and wonder, what can God possibly do with this? And sometimes churches ask that same question. We look around and realize that the world has changed. The church has changed. Our communities have changed. The ways people worship, connect, communicate, volunteer, and participate have changed. And sometimes our instinct is to look back and say, if only we could get back to the way things used to be. But Isaiah does not say, go back. Isaiah says, look back. There is a difference. Look back and remember. Remember the rock from which you were hewn. Remember the people who taught you to love. Remember the people who taught you to pray. Remember the saints that sat in these very pews. Remember the people who taught Sunday school. Remember those who sang in the choir, and remember those who served meals, visited the sick, cared for neighbors, welcomed strangers, worked for justice, and quietly showed up whenever someone needed them. Just remember them. Give thanks for them. Honor them. But don't try to recreate this world. Instead, remember the God they trusted, because that God is still here among us. The God who called Abraham and Sarah is still calling. The God who spoke hope to people in exile is still speaking. The God who promised gardens in the wilderness is still planting seeds today. And the God who worked through generations before us is still working through each and every one of us. This reminds me, of course, of this wonderful image that Todd Balsinger writes about in his book, Canoeing the Mountains. Of course, the title comes from the story of Lewis and Clark's expedition. Of course, if you don't know the story, I'll give you a brief summary. Lewis and Clark had been commissioned to explore the newly acquired Western Territory and find a water route across the continent. They were experienced explorers. They knew rivers. They had boats. They had equipment. They had developed the skills necessary for their journey that they would be expected to make. And they believed that they would be able to paddle their way west from the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They believed, and of course, when they reached the Rocky Mountains, suddenly their world in front of them did not match the world they had prepared for. They had canoes, but there was no rivers. They had skills, but those skills alone could not take them where they needed to go. They had maps, but the maps could only take them so far. Balsinger uses that moment as a picture of what it means to lead and live faithfully in a changing world. Sometimes we reach a place where the landscape has completely changed, and the methods that brought us this far may not be the methods that can carry us forward into the future. The temptation is to stand at the foot of the mountains, holding tightly to our canoes and saying, but this is how we got here. And that may be absolutely true. Those canoes were valuable. They carried the expedition a tremendous distance. They should be appreciated. They should be remembered. But eventually you have to put down the canoe, not because the canoe was bad, not because the journey that brought you there was wrong, but because the landscape has completely changed. And perhaps there is something there for the church. The church has inherited some wonderful canoes, traditions, programs, ways of worshiping, ways of organizing, ways of communicating, ways of serving our communities. Many of them have carried the church faithfully for generations. And yes, we should honor them. We should give thanks for them. But our calling is not simply to preserve a canoe. Our calling is to follow God. And sometimes following God means discovering the landscape ahead looks very different from the landscape behind us. And that is where Isaiah becomes so important. Look to the rock from which you were hewn. Notice that Isaiah does not tell the people to recreate Abraham and Sarah's lives. He tells them to remember their faith, remember their trust, remember the God who called them into an unknown future. Abraham and Sarah themselves had to leave familiar territory. They had to trust God without knowing exactly where the journey would lead them. And perhaps that is the deeper connection. Faithfulness does not always mean repeating what is faithfulness does not always mean repeating what faithful people did before us. Sometimes faithfulness means trusting the same God they trusted while walking into a landscape that they had never walked through before. We still carry their faith, we carry their courage, we carry their love, we carry their commitment to God and to neighbor. But we may have to discover new ways of expressing those things in our own time. We do not abandon the rock from which we were hewn. We remember it. We stand upon it. And then we keep walking. And that, of course, brings me to Psalm 138. The psalmist begins with gratitude. I give you thanks, O Lord, with my whole heart. Why? Because the psalmist has experienced God's faithfulness. On the day I called, you answered me. You increased my strength of my soul. I love that phrase. God did not necessarily remove every difficulty. God gave the psalmist strength of soul. Later, the psalmist says, though I walk in the midst of trouble, you preserve me. Notice what the psalmist does not say. He did not say, because I trust God, I will never walk through trouble again. It says, though I walk in the midst of trouble. Faith does not mean that trouble never comes. Faith means trouble does not get the final word. Faith means that when we find ourselves walking through the wilderness or standing at the foot of mountains we never expected to climb, we can trust that we are not alone in that moment. God is there. God preserves. God strengthens. God reaches out a hand. And then we come to one of my favorite lines in the psalm. The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me. Your steadfast love, O Lord, endures forever. What a beautiful statement. God is not finished with me yet. I wonder what would happen if we actually believe that. Not just about ourselves when we were young, not just when everything is going well in our lives, not just when the future seems obvious, but at every single stage of life. God is not finished with me yet. Maybe you're 85. God is not finished with you. Maybe you're 45 and wondering where all those years have already gone, and God is not finished with you. Maybe you're 25 and have absolutely no idea where life is leading you. God isn't finished with you. Maybe you have made mistakes you wish you could go and undo, but God is not finished with you. Maybe grief has changed the landscape of your life entirely, but God isn't finished with you. Maybe you are standing in a wilderness you never expected to be in, and God is still not finished with you. And maybe the canoe that carried you faithfully for years no longer works in the landscape that you are now facing. God still isn't finished with you. You are still the work of God's hands. And so am I, and so is this church. And perhaps that is why the final words of Psalm 138 are so moving. After all this confidence, after all this praise, after declaring that God's steadfast love endures forever, the psalmist ends with a prayer. Do not forsake the work of your hands. There is something wonderfully human about that. The psalmist believes, the psalmist trusts, the psalmist remembers God's faithfulness, and still there is a little prayer. God, please keep working on me. Don't give up on me. Don't leave the work unfinished. And perhaps that should be our prayer too. God, do not forsake the work of your hands. Keep shaping us, keep stretching us, keep teaching us, keep challenging us, keep softening the places in us that have become hard. Keep opening our eyes to people we have failed to see. Keep widening our compassion and keep deepening our courage. And when the landscape changes, give us enough faith to change with it. Give us wisdom to know what must never be abandoned and courage to release what no longer serves us on the journey. Help us distinguish between our deepest calling and the methods we have used to live out that calling. Keep transforming us into people you created us to become, because following God is not about becoming a finished product. We are always becoming, always learning, always being shaped, always being called a little farther. And Isaiah reminds us that God's work within us eventually becomes God's work through us. God says, "A teaching will go out from me, and my justice for a light to all peoples." God's restoration is never meant only for ourselves. We are comforted so that we can comfort. We are loved so that we can love. We receive grace so that we may become gracious. We experience welcome so that we can welcome. We discover hope so that we can carry hope into someone else's wilderness in this world. That is what it means to be the work of God's hands. God works in us so that God's love can work through us. So perhaps today, Isaiah invites us to do three things. Remember, look to the rock from which you were hewn. Remember the people who shaped you. Remember the experiences that formed you. Remember the moments when grace carried you farther than you ever thought you could go. Remember God's faithfulness. Remember the canoes that brought you this far and give thanks for them. Then trust. Trust the God who is faithful yesterday is still faithful today. Even in the wilderness, even when the future is unclear, even when the old maps no longer seem to work, even when we stand before mountains we never expected to encounter. Trust that God can still turn deserts into gardens. And third, become. Allow God to keep working on you because you are not finished. I'm not finished. This church isn't finished. God is still shaping all of us, still calling us, still sending us, still turning wilderness into gardens, still bringing hope out of places we thought were empty, still making something beautiful out of ordinary human lives. So look back. Remember the rock from which you were hewn. Give thanks for everything and everyone who helped to bring you this far in the journey. Honor the canoes that carried you, but do not confuse the canoe for calling. When the river becomes a mountain, trust God enough to learn a new way forward. Then turn your face toward tomorrow, because the same God who was faithful then is faithful now. And the same God who has carried us this far is already waiting for us in whatever comes next. The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me. Your steadfast love, O Lord, endures forever. And so our prayer becomes very simple. O God, do not forsake the work of your hands. Keep working in us, keep working through us. And when we find ourselves standing in the wilderness or at the top or at the foot of mountains we never expected to climb, give us courage to follow you. Help us to remember where we came from without being afraid of where you are leading us. And help us trust that somewhere beneath the dry ground, you have already planted a garden. Praise be to God. Amen.